On December 7, 1941, while the sun rose gently over the Pacific and cast warm golden light across the quiet naval base at Pearl Harbor, Japan launched an attack that they believed would cripple the United States so severely that it would have no choice but to negotiate, an attack that Japanese planners had rehearsed down to the last second, believing that by striking first, striking hard, and striking without warning, they would achieve the knockout blow needed to secure their domination across Asia and the Pacific, but in doing so, they triggered a force far larger, far more determined, and far more relentless than they ever expected, a force that, once awakened, would reshape the course of history with a power and intensity that engulfed the world. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared down upon the unsuspecting harbor, sailors scrambled from their bunks, many half-dressed, confused and disoriented, hearing explosions without understanding their source, stumbling into a scene that looked like the end of the world. Battleships erupting in flames, aircraft swallowed by fire, hangars collapsing, and a sky filled with the thunder of enemy bombers diving through thick black smoke. Japan celebrated what they believed was a flawless victory, a masterstroke that would break America's will and buy them enough time to secure oil fields, fortify islands, and build the impregnable empire their leaders dreamed of. But they had misjudged the United States in the most devastating way possible. Because instead of fear, the attack ignited something else, something far more dangerous, an anger, a unity, a resolve so fierce that it would mobilize an entire nation into the greatest industrial war machine the world had ever seen. At first, Japanese commanders believed they had succeeded beyond their expectations. They had sunk battleships, destroyed aircraft, crippled facilities, and shocked the American public. Newspapers around the world declared that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant, but at the moment of the attack, even Japan did not fully comprehend how accurate that metaphor would become. What they had struck was not a weak nation, nor an unprepared opponent, but an industrial giant whose factories, shipyards, and assembly lines, once set into motion, would produce weapons, ships, ammunition, and vehicles at a pace so overwhelming that no Axis nation could hope to match it. As the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor and the ruins of the USS Arizona continued to burn, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech, and the United States shifted overnight from a country divided by isolationist debates into one unified by a purpose that cut deeper than politics, deeper than ideology, deeper even than patriotism. It became a mission to ensure that such a betrayal, such an attack, would never happen again. America's industrial might surged to life with a roar, and factories that once built cars and household appliances were transformed into war production lines that operated day and night without pause. Men lined up at recruitment centers, women entered factories for the first time on a massive scale, and engineers began designing, improving, and constructing machines that would redefine modern warfare, from aircraft like the B-29 Superfortress to carriers like the Essex class, submarines that prowled the Pacific, and tanks that rolled across Europe. Japan watched with growing unease as reports filtered in. America was not slowing down, not negotiating, not hesitating, they were accelerating. By the end of 1942, the United States had produced more aircraft than Japan could hope to replace in years. By 1943, American shipyards were launching more tonnage every month than Japan could build in an entire year. By 1944, the Pacific had become an American battleground, one Japan once dominated but now struggled desperately to hold. Japan had expected a quick war. Instead, they faced a relentless juggernaut fueled by anger and united by loss. Japanese strategists realized their mistake too late. They believed the attack would demoralize Americans, but instead it fused them together in a shared national purpose, transforming citizens into soldiers, mechanics, welders, pilots, nurses, and commanders who all moved in the same direction, toward victory. The carriers Japan failed to destroy at Pearl Harbor, the USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, became the core of the fleet that pushed back across the Pacific, winning battles at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. At Midway, codebreakers at Station Hypo turned intelligence into a decisive advantage, allowing American pilots to strike Japanese carriers with precision that shocked the Imperial Navy. Japan lost 4 carriers in one day, a blow they could never recover from, and suddenly the empire that had spread so quickly across the Pacific began to shrink. Island by island, mile by mile, the United States advanced, building airfields, establishing bases, and tightening a noose around Japan. As the months turned into years, American factories continued their relentless output. Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines every few days. Aircraft carriers multiplied. Pilots trained in vast numbers. Submarines cut off Japanese supply routes, strangling their economy and isolating their soldiers. Japan had underestimated the American spirit, but they had also underestimated American technology. New radars, new bomb sights, new aircraft engines, new artillery designs, every innovation widened the gap between the two nations. By 1944, the skies over the Pacific belonged to the United States. B-29 bombers launched from captured islands reached the Japanese mainland, and suddenly the war that once seemed so distant arrived over Tokyo. Japanese leaders, who had once celebrated the attack on Pearl Harbor as their moment of triumph, now watched their cities burn, their fleets sink, their resources dwindle, and their hopes disappear. The nation that they believed would retreat, the nation they believed lacked the will to fight, had instead become their worst nightmare. By the time American Marines planted the flag atop Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, Japan finally understood the full cost of their miscalculation. Pearl Harbor had not crippled the United States, it had transformed it. Pearl Harbor had not discouraged the American people, it had united them. Pearl Harbor had not broken America's spirit, it had ignited it. And in the end, as the war drew toward its final, devastating conclusion, Japan realized the full weight of their decision, because by attacking first, by waking the giant, they had set into motion the very force that would bring their empire crashing down. What began as a surprise attack meant to secure dominance became the very spark that ensured Japan would face an enemy more powerful, more determined, and more unstoppable than they had ever imagined, an enemy that would reshape the Pacific, reshape global power, and reshape history itself. Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. After the flames of Pearl Harbor settled into smoldering wreckage and the echoes of the attack faded into a silence heavy with loss, the United States, still reeling, still mourning, shifted into a phase of transformation so enormous that even Japan could not have imagined the scale of change it had just set in motion, because the attack did not simply awaken a giant, it redirected the entire industrial, military, and emotional power of a continent toward one purpose: victory at any cost. Across America, the first waves of mobilization swept through cities and towns with a force that felt almost tidal. Young men who had never left their hometowns lined up in front of recruitment stations in staggering numbers. Factories that once produced commercial goods were converted into round-the-clock war plants. And shipyards that had been quiet suddenly roared with life as sparks from welding torches lit up the night like bursts of battlefield fire. Women stepped into roles they had never been allowed to hold, mastering machinery, riveting steel, assembling engines, and proving that American industry did not have limits. It only needed motivation, and Japan had provided it. Meanwhile, deep within the Imperial Japanese Navy, commanders watched with growing unease as American production, once underestimated and dismissed, began pouring into the Pacific like a rising flood. The ships Japan believed would take years to replace were being constructed in months. The aircraft they hoped to keep up with were being manufactured in thousands. The pilots they once believed inexperienced were now trained through streamlined programs that turned recruits into skilled aviators with unprecedented speed. And while Japan fortified its positions across the Pacific, from Rabaul to the Solomons, from the Gilberts to the Marianas, the United States began developing an operational strategy unlike anything Japan had prepared for: island hopping. Instead of fighting every enemy stronghold head-on, American planners chose to bypass the most fortified islands, cutting off their supply lines, isolating their troops, and leaving them to wither in silence. Each bypassed garrison became a stranded force slowly starving, slowly realizing the empire they fought for could no longer protect them. Japanese soldiers wrote in their diaries about dwindling ammunition, empty stomachs, and skies filled with enemy aircraft that seemed to appear in endless waves. They could feel the empire shrinking from beneath their boots. Japan's nightmare deepened when American submarines, once plagued by faulty torpedoes and poor coordination, suddenly became some of the deadliest hunters in the Pacific, sinking Japanese merchant ships, tankers, transport vessels, and even warships with a ruthless efficiency that choked Japan's lifeline to the resources it needed for survival. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies, once the backbone of Japan's war machine, dropped to a trickle. Without fuel, the mighty Japanese fleet that had once threatened the Pacific became an armada trapped in its own harbors. But perhaps the most devastating blow to Japan's hopes came from the air, the arrival of the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of its time, capable of flying higher, farther, and carrying more destruction than any aircraft Japan had ever faced. When the first formations of B-29s lifted off from bases in the Marianas, Japanese radar operators watched their screens with disbelief, knowing that for the first time in the war, their homeland lay fully within the reach of American bombers. Tokyo, which once believed distance would protect it, now found its skies filled with engines that sounded like rolling thunder as waves of B-29s soared overhead, dropping bombs that turned entire districts into infernos. Civilians huddled in shelters, staring at the destruction and asking themselves what their leaders had awakened on that December morning in Hawaii. Meanwhile, American Marines and soldiers fought brutal campaigns on islands like Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Okinawa, learning firsthand the ferocity of Japanese resistance, but still advancing inexorably, determinedly, mile by mile, driven by the memory of Pearl Harbor and fueled by the industrial might that Japan could no longer match. Every victory brought American forces closer to Japan, and every island captured tightened the noose around the empire's throat. By late 1944, Japan's leaders held desperate meetings inside underground bunkers, debating strategies, arguing over dwindling supplies, and receiving reports that painted a future darker than they were willing to admit. Their navy was shattered, their air force depleted, their soldiers starving on distant islands, and their ability to produce weapons crippled by lack of resources. Yet even in the face of overwhelming odds, Japan refused to surrender, believing that the United States, despite its strength, would hesitate when faced with the prospect of invading the Japanese mainland. But American planners were already considering a far more devastating option, one that had emerged from laboratories and secret facilities across the country, a weapon more powerful than anything humanity had ever created. And as American scientists edged closer to unlocking the power of the atom, Japan found itself running out of time, trapped in a war it had started but could no longer steer, realizing too late that the blow they had struck at Pearl Harbor had not weakened their enemy. It had forged their destroyer. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. And so, as the Pacific War surged toward its final act, the consequences of Pearl Harbor, an attack Japan once celebrated as its greatest triumph, morphed into the very chain of events that sealed its defeat, for by 1945 the United States had transformed itself into a war machine of unimaginable scale, a nation producing aircraft at a rate Japan could not comprehend, building ships faster than Japan could sink them, training pilots who now dominated the skies, and unleashing a strategic bombing campaign that left Japanese cities smoldering under relentless waves of fire. Yet even as Japan's leaders watched industrial districts crumble and military reports grow more desperate by the hour, they clung to the hope that American resolve would falter before an invasion of the Japanese mainland, counting on the belief that urban warfare, kamikaze attacks, and mass civilian resistance would force Washington to reconsider. But they did not understand that America, fueled by the memory of Pearl Harbor and hardened by 4 years of bloodshed, had no intention of retreating, because each American family who had lost sons at Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Leyte, or Iwo Jima carried within them a determination that matched the nation's industrial might. Meanwhile, American codebreakers, who had already turned Japan's encrypted messages into open books, continued to expose Japanese plans before they unfolded, allowing U.S. commanders to strike with near-perfect precision, further tightening the noose around the empire's shrinking perimeter. In the final months of the war, as American forces captured Okinawa in one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, the last barrier between U.S. troops. And the Japanese homeland fell, leaving Japan cornered, exhausted, starved of fuel, choked by submarine blockades, and increasingly aware that their once mighty empire now existed only on maps drawn before 1942. Inside Tokyo, Prime Minister Suzuki and his advisors debated surrender in whispers, fearing the wrath of military hardliners who vowed to fight until the last breath. While Emperor Hirohito listened silently as generals insisted they could still inflict enough casualties to force a negotiated peace, even though Japan's cities lay in ruins, its factories silent, its once dominant air force reduced to kamikaze units, flying outdated aircraft held together by desperation and wire. But America, standing on the brink of an invasion that promised catastrophic casualties on both sides, chose a different path, one forged in secrecy beneath the laboratories of Los Alamos, where scientists had harnessed the raw power of the atom to create a weapon that dwarfed every bomb dropped before it, a weapon so devastating the world had no way to measure its destructive potential until August 6, 1945. When a B-29 named Enola Gay soared over Hiroshima and released a single bomb that unleashed a blinding flash, a pillar of fire, and a shockwave that swallowed an entire city in seconds, leaving survivors stunned, burned, and speechless as they wandered through streets turned to ash. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same unimaginable fate, and the Japanese High Command, confronted with destruction beyond comprehension, finally understood that the war they had begun on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii now threatened to erase their entire nation from existence. In an underground bunker, as smoke from the bombed-out city above drifted through ventilation shafts, the emperor made a decision no Japanese ruler had ever made before. He would speak directly to his people, his voice trembling but clear as he announced Japan's surrender, telling his nation that to continue fighting would not only lead to the collapse of the empire but also to the extinction of human civilization itself. And so, on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, Japanese officials signed the documents that formally ended World War II, bowing before the Allied representatives as American sailors stood in silent formation, a moment that symbolized not just the end of a war, but the culmination of a chain of events that Japan had set in motion 4 years earlier with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Across the United States, news of victory sparked celebrations, parades, tears, relief, and remembrance, for Americans knew that the victory in the Pacific had been purchased with the lives of thousands, forged by an industrial force unlike anything the world had ever seen, and driven by a national resolve born the moment Japanese planes appeared over Oahu. Japan, once confident in its swift victories, now faced the task of rebuilding a nation devastated by war, humbled by defeat, and forever marked by the consequences of a decision its leaders once believed would secure dominance. In the years to come, historians would look back on Pearl Harbor not as a triumph of strategy, but as one of the greatest miscalculations in military history, a strike meant to cripple America that instead awakened its might, unified its people, and set in motion a relentless campaign that pushed across the Pacific, crushed an empire, and reshaped the world order. And so the truth became clear: Japan had not just attacked Pearl Harbor, it had awakened a force that would sweep across oceans, break the backbone of its military, and ultimately bring the empire to its knees, leaving one undeniable lesson carved into the memory of nations: sometimes the first blow is not the beginning of victory, but the beginning of the end. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.